Welcome to the College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line. Here's Shehan J. Haraja and Bobak Hayeri.
Hey everybody, it's the College Football Survivor Show. I'm Bobak Hayeri, nursing a slight cold, with my co-host Shehan J. Haraja, national college football writer for CBS Sports. We're glad to have you with us. And after a fairly static week 3, we actually had some drama in week 4. Several teams lost. We'll get a chance to talk about them and their status as survivors. We've got votes to take, and we're going to rank the head coaches of playoff teams in the second half of the show. But before we dive in, let me remind you, you can always find us on X and TikTok at CFB Survivor Show, where we have video highlights of the show, run polls, and listen to your feedback. Take a moment, if you can, to like, rate, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. But my goodness, week 4, what an exciting week it was. You know, before we start, I'll just run down. We're the Survivor Show. We've got a list of teams we got to go through. And we're going to talk about, who we're going to keep on, who we're going to vote off. There's certain rules to that. But we started with Georgia, who had a good week with the bye. Obviously, they've got a big game coming up. Texas had no problem playing ULM. Ohio State finally got to play another team, and it was Marshall. So I guess we'll see where that goes. Alabama had a bye. Ole Miss got their win over Georgia Southern. Penn State just slammed Kent State. Kansas State lost on the road at BYU. We'll probably talk about them in a bit. Miami had no trouble with USF. USC also lost to Michigan in a closer matchup, which we'll be probably talking about. Mizzou had an overtime victory over the Commodores. Maybe talking about them as well. Tennessee beat Oklahoma in a game that was, I think, not as close as the score would indicate. And our G5 team, NIU, croaked to Buffalo overtime at home after a bye week. I mean, there's just, again, to kind of summarize the rules here, we have to vote off one team each week. Last week was harder because everyone won. This year, we've got options, and we don't have to vote off just one team. We can vote off more than one. The thing is, we added rules this season because of the new 12-team playoff. If we have to have a representative of all the P4 conferences, so if you vote off the only Big Ten team, you've got to vote on another Big Ten team in its place, or Big 12, or ACC, or SEC, hypothetically. And if the G5 gets voted off, we have to replace it with another G5 team. So those are the rules of our survivor pool as it is. But all that said, setting the table, Shehan, how are you?
I'm doing well. It's been a busy start to the season, I would say. I, again, really was hoping that we wouldn't have to deal with so much realignment in the first few weeks. But no, this is coming minutes after I wrote a story for CBS that 4 AAC teams are deciding to stay in the AAC and not go to the Pac-12. That's UTSA, Tulane, South Florida, and Memphis. They're going to stay in the AAC. So things are about to get real interesting, and I'm glad we don't have to worry about that on this particular podcast, where we get to actually talk about college football, which is pretty fun.
Wait. You don't want to talk about whether the P12, goodness, the Pac-12 should just go ahead and take all 3 service academies?
Listen, I mean, right now, the Mountain West has the worst one because the other 2 are about to, they're 3-0, 4-0. Like they are off to an interesting start. I think that both of them are 2-0 also in AAC conference play, which is crazy to think about. I don't know what's going on right now in the service academy world. I do know that Air Force is not very good, but no, I think that I would much rather just stay on the football field than actually, that would be really funny. The conference with the legacy of like Cal Berkeley getting all 3 military academies into it, that would definitely be quite an experience. The idea of conference games coming from West Point, New York, to play in San Diego instead. Although I guess that's a military city. That's probably not the worst one. That's not the worst one. But whichever one you want to throw out there in Corvallis, Oregon, whatever it is, I don't think that we need to worry about that right this second. But like you said, we've been waiting for things to kind of crack open in some ways in the college football playoff race. And I promised myself on Twitter, I am not going to get into arguments about whether the 12-team playoff is good or bad anymore, because guess what? Like, it doesn't matter. It's happening. This is reality now. But I do want to make a small case real quick for why I think the 12-team playoff has been pretty cool so far. Look at all the games that have ended up mattering and changing the shape of the race through the first 4 weeks of the season. Now, look, NIU did not officially knock Notre Dame out of the playoff, but like it made a huge impact on not just Notre Dame's place in the playoff race, but also NIU's, also the Max, also like you look at every other G5 contender, then all of a sudden they go and play Buffalo, they lose that game, that changes the shape of the playoff race. I think what we're not used to is the idea of teams that aren't one of like 12 teams playing games that impact the national picture. And to me, that's really cool. I love the fact that we're getting to see some of that in college football right now. But that's an aside. I don't want to, again, I'm trying to not get into arguments about this because I do feel like there have been so many already positive impacts of the 12-team playoff in the way that the sport is allowed to be covered now. But I think that having a playoff specific podcast heading into a college football season, like this has been perfect. This has been, I think, in some ways, everything that we hoped it could possibly be when, frankly, me and Doug decided to start this podcast 3 years ago.
Exactly. There are just so many fun angles to all of this. And even the weekday games have actually had a lot of impact, more so than usual. I mean, again, we probably won't get too into depth on it, but watching Illinois go into Nebraska and win suddenly made me think, well, are we going to now have to start thinking, not necessarily right now, but eventually Illinois might get on the radar. You know, they've got a intriguing game with Penn State now. So who knows? I mean, could you imagine suddenly we're going to be talking about where to put the Illini in all of this? But really, what it's got down to it, though, we better look at our survivors right now. We've got a couple of teams we've got to talk about. I mean, I'm going to and I'm not trying to be biased here, but the first one on the block, I think, is probably the easiest one to make a call, and that's Kansas State going on the road. Well, and actually, I'm going to put an asterisk on that because we're still early enough in the season where BYU is actually now 4-0 and ranked. But you know, of course, that's partially thanks to Kansas State going there and losing the way they did. Now, I don't know where we're going to get out of BYU. They're going to be playing at Baylor, which is a whole other kettle of fish. We can talk about that game. And then,
do we need to talk about
Kansas
that game?
State,
I don't think we need to talk about that game.
yeah. Meanwhile, though, Kansas State, they get to test themselves again pretty quickly. They do play Oklahoma State. They're coming into town. You know, obviously Oklahoma State lost to Utah, but they're still ranked. So to be fair, this is kind of what we thought we'd get out of the Big 12, where it's going to still be unclear who the leader. I mean, there is, I think, one team that has sort of reasserted itself, but it's still kind of a mystery conference in a lot of ways, especially towards the top. But what do you make of Kansas State? I'm thinking they're the easiest vote off the island at this point. But where are you? Well, I don't want to pick on NIU, but of the P4 teams, I feel bad. I feel like, okay, well, we appreciate you and love you, little brother, but we don't want. Well, it's okay. But I mean, of the P4, I think Kansas State is the easier one to make a call on right now.
Well, I want to be clear too, right? So we've kind of had some conversations about shifting the way that we approach kind of the vote off the island type thing when it comes to the group of five, where we're almost going to have a separate group of five conversation and a separate group of five ranking because it's so interesting. And honestly, it's been the best subplot in college football this season to this point is the race for that group of five spot. It's shifted every single week. By the way, Memphis made their job a whole lot harder because they lost to one of those service academies, lost to Navy this past week. But I think that Kansas State is the easy team to kick off right now. I think it's probably the right team to kick off right now. And look, I think that they had that game where they crush Arizona 31-7 on a Friday night, one of those Friday night games that you were talking about. But this is, I think, some of the struggle with having a freshman quarterback or a first year quarterback. I think he's technically a sophomore, is that you get these moments of brilliance and you get these moments of being lost. And this was one of the biggest games that he's played in a road environment. BYU is an incredible road environment. It's a tough place to play. I did see a quote after the game where Avery Johnson, their quarterback, said, it was one of the weirdest experiences I've ever had because the fans were loud, but they were almost like encouraging at the same time, which is the most BYU thing I've ever heard. Honestly, BYU, like, such a fascinating program to me. I love that they get to be part of major college football now. But you don't know how he's going to react in that kind of environment, and he reacted with 2 interceptions in that game. I do think Kansas State, to me, is still very much in the conversation. Like, they're going to be there in the top 20, top 25 at the end of the year. They're going to have a chance heading into November to go to the Big 12 title game, but they are not right now, to me, the top team from the Big 12. They are not the top contender to me from the Big 12. I actually think that there's maybe 2 or 3 teams that I'm more interested in, and we'll certainly get to at least one of them. I think maybe we can have a conversation about another in just a second, but Kansas State is the team right now. When you lose the way that they did last week, Kansas State, I think that you deserve to be pushed off the island. I will say I put up to a vote 3 teams, which teams should be kicked off of our list of college football playoff contenders. We'll talk about the 2 others as well, but Kansas State not only got a plurality of the vote, but actually got a majority with 54.5% of the 3 options.
Yeah, I think that's a safe bet. So Kansas State, we're going to take you off, and then maybe after we'll get back to the Big 12 and talk about who we're going to replace you with. The next team that lost was, of course, USC. It was a physical game. So, I mean, credit to USC. They showed they can be physical with probably one of them. I mean, I'm not going to say they're the cream of the crop, but certainly one of the more physical teams in the Big Ten, especially on defense. The Wolverines' defense did well enough. USC's defense did almost well enough. That was the thing. Like, it was a fascinating game to watch because it came down to 3 big runs, and that they were well earned. Like, it was one of those games where one team just didn't seem to completely mess up. It just seemed like Kalel Mullings really just had a game and got past a couple of poor tackles, which, you could say, oh, Grinch is in the history. But I mean, even Danton Lynn's group did all they could to get those guys ready for that game. But eventually, unsurprisingly, that important one came at the end of the game in the 4th quarter when you do wear down a defense. We saw that, and we saw the USC defense adjust in the second half. But ultimately, behind the passing attack of Alex Orji, and all 32 yards, Michigan managed to win at home. So I don't know where I'm at with USC. I don't know. I mean, they get a game at Wisconsin at home to kind of see if they can bounce back. Not a guaranteed win by any chance. They go on the road out here to play the Gophers, and then they get to host Penn State on the 12th, which is, of course, the same day Oregon's hosting Ohio State. So a couple of interesting games now. I'm leaning towards voting them off. I can't believe it, but I'm just kind of like, they'll get a chance to get back on. The Big Ten, with the Big Ten and the SEC, most of these teams, if you take 1 loss, even 2 losses, you still have a chance to fight your way back on simply because of the nature of the conference, unless you're, a Rutgers type schedule. But, where are you on this?
It's tough. I mean, I definitely think that they've proven that they belong in this conversation, that they are a legitimate college football playoff contender, but we cut our list off at 12. Like, it's a very exclusive list, a very exclusive group to be a part of. And I think that, because I do want to talk about Michigan in the context of this game as well. Michigan was held until the final drive of the game to 9 offensive yards in the second half. So I when we have this conversation about USC and, oh my gosh, they're not ready, they don't play defense, they're not I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. I think that USC showed in this game, hey, we have what it takes to be a college football playoff team. We are not just improved, but pretty dang improved. And it was ultimately 2 things. It was a pick 6 by Miller Moss on just a great play by Will Johnson, the cornerback. If I'm a team playing Michigan, I am putting a circle around where Will Johnson is on the field and saying, just throw it anywhere else. Because the rest of their secondary is good, not great. But Will Johnson is that level of player. I believe he actually had a pick 6 last week as well. Was it against Fresno State? I think he had that. And he's that kind of player. Don't throw at him. Just don't do it.
Yeah. It was strength on strength. It was strength on strength. Miller Moss is just not quite there yet. He may not be the level of the ultimate elite quarterbacks. Will Johnson, no question, he's an elite. Yes. So we literally watched talent, and no one was making boneheaded mistakes. It was just the kind of football plays that you expect to see. And that I'm trying not to let my USC fanness bleed out here, because I do also think there shouldn't be. I actually did vote to take him off. But I mean, I was just, as a USC fan, I'm kind of relieved. Like, if you're going to lose, okay, I'll take that loss, because I can't even imagine what it would have been like last season. I can't even imagine.
Right. Well, I think what I'd say too is, look, there are moments in college football where, and I wrote about this a little bit after the game for CBSSports.com, where you see what championship effort looks like. Like, where you see like championship second win, where you see championship execution. And I think that last drive was the first time that USC has seen what that looks like in a very long time. The last time that USC played the reigning national champions was when they were climbing over themselves coming out of the tunnel to play Alabama and got beat 52-6. So, like, and by the way, seeing what that looked like and realizing that we do not play with it actually helped launch them to their best season in a great many years, right? They won the Rose Bowl that year after they got embarrassed in week 1. So I do think that USC is going to learn and grow from this game. I think that they're going to be much better for having played this game. And frankly, in a lot of ways, USC was the better team on Saturday for most of the game, but it is those moments in the margins where Michigan has made a living these past 4 years. And I think that USC now has on film, this is what it looks like. All this to say, USC, I still feel very confident will be in our discussion at the end of the year, but right now, you're in timeout. Yeah, you got to get out of here. When you go on the road and lose, unfortunately, even if it was a close game, I mean, you can't be there on the 1 yard line with a chance to win and set yourself up as potentially the top contender to Ohio State in the Big Ten and lose like that.
Absolutely. All right, next up, and this one, I guess we'll do a G5, because I could think of one other team I'd like to discuss. But let's move to another fairly easy conversation, which is unfortunately for Northern Illinois. We had a long conversation last week about whether we should swap them anyway. And I felt that it didn't feel right, just because they had a bye week, to punish them. But when you apparently look past Buffalo against that road game at NC State, and you lose in overtime, but still lose at home to a team that did not look competitive earlier this season, sorry, Huskies, you're done. And by the way, Mac, oh my goodness, Toledo losing to Western Kentucky on the road, also not great. So we unfortunately, meanwhile, Bowling Green is just putting the fear of the Falcons and everybody they play. I mean, my favorite response were some of the fans. Who did they play this past week? I can't remember, but it was
Texas A&M.
Penn State. We understand now. But pretty easy conversation though.
Yeah, unfortunately so. And the funny thing about this conversation is the team that was the top contender to jump them, again, was Memphis, who lost this week to Navy. So there, I don't think, is a surefire, no question about it, top 3. And I think that when we get to the end of this first segment, we're going to jump into maybe our top 3 ranking for this. But I mean, NIU's path was always difficult. This is actually, I think, to me, an interesting conversation, which is, we value, for example, the big upsets. And whenever they happen against brand names, whenever they happen, we kind of are like, well, we have to elevate the team that pulled the upset. Now, I think it was great that NIU was in the top 25. Like, that's super cool to me. I do not care about what happened after. I love the fact that they got to have a number by their name. But I think that ultimately for me, like, it doesn't change the way that I think about NIU just because they beat Notre Dame, just because they pulled an upset. I said the same thing about Boston College. I said the same thing about Georgia Tech in week 1. Like, I just think that we shouldn't overreact too much to just necessarily one individual great results. And so, unfortunately, they're out.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the other team I wanted to mention, only because in previous weeks, I'm like, why do we always include them? It feels kind of unfair. But Mizzou, another close win, this time to Vanderbilt, who has seemed better than usual, But they were thankful that these other games were happening, because there were moments everyone was looking at that scoreboard and like, what is happening right now in Columbia? To be fair, there's always a team each year that seems to win by the skin of their teeth week after week. Is that the Tigers? I mean, do we feel confident enough in including them? To be fair, I went back and checked. They are Buffalo's only loss, and they beat those dastardly Bulls 38-0, which isn't something that UMass or Northern Illinois could boast. But what do we make of this?
There's nothing structurally concerning at this point about Missouri necessarily, but they got to have some better efforts in these games. Like, you can't go to double overtime against Vanderbilt when you are the number 7 team in the country. You just can't do it. And, I think it's a credit to them that they were able to come out and ultimately put them away in overtime. Like, the final numbers in this game look perfectly fine. If you're Missouri, right? 442 yards to 324, 22 first downs to 15, 5.4 yards per carry to 4 point. Like, all the numbers say you should have won this game more comfortably than you ultimately did. They didn't turn the ball over even. Like, it's one of those games where, hey, like, Vanderbilt just has a little something. They just managed to convert some key opportunities and make this game close. But in a normal week, I think that this would send Missouri off to probation, right? Like, that would get them potentially kicked off. Like you said, we've already kicked 3 teams off this week from our top 12. They're a little lucky that this hasn't happened. Now they get a bye. I think they need to collect themselves, because the next week after that, they go to Texas A&M. And while I don't know that Texas A&M has it figured out offensively, defensively, they are pretty good. If they have another, hey, we're going to overtime game on the road against Texas A&M, I think it's time then to start having some conversations.
Indeed, and that's their first road game, no less. I forgot about that, because they had BC and Vandy at home. Oh my goodness! So maybe they'll get to test that out. But all right, so we've eliminated 3 teams. Banner year for this, banner week, I should say, for this season. We've got to start letting teams on. Now, the first thing we have to do is 2 of these we have to replace them with an equivalent. The first one, and we don't have to replace each of them, for the record. We don't have to go back up to 12. But 2 of them, we do have to at least go back up to 11. So with the Big 12, I mean, the leader seems to be pretty clear. Utah went on the road and played the best game in the state of Oklahoma, which was this past week, which was defeating number 14 Oklahoma State 22-19. It was, yes, Cam Rising was injured, but it was defense and the offense of Micah Bernard as a running back. Isaac Wilson, Zach's, of course, brother, didn't do anything wrong, kept the offense moving. And yeah, that Utah offensive line is exceptional. I mean, they rushed for like 273 yards. It was something like that. And that defense adjusted to the passing attack, that quick passing attack of Oklahoma State. The Utes kind of then are pretty smooth moving forward, though. They get Arizona next weekend, but then not too many bad games for a while. Do we see enough from Utah to consider putting them back in a spot which they had previously given up to the Wildcats?
I'm going to say yes. Yes, I'm going to say
specific
yes.
in that conference.
Yes. They went on the road against a team ranked top 3 in the preseason poll in the conference, and the final score was 22-19, but it wasn't actually that close. It was actually 22-3 with about 6 minutes left in the game, and Oklahoma State went on sort of a crazy run after inserting Alan Bowman back into the lineup after benching him, by the way, earlier in the game. And look, I think that if Utah's going to be the dominant team in the Big 12, like, they're going to need Cameron Rising at some point. They are. Like, I think that to be the best team in the conference, without a doubt, like, they need Cameron Rising in the lineup, but they can, like, eke their way mostly there without him, even with the freshman quarterback and Isaac Wilson. Wilson threw 2 interceptions, but neither of them really cost them too much. Like you said, the next couple of weeks, Arizona, they get them at home. They've been a little disappointing at Arizona State, TCU, at Houston. That BYU game, the Holy War, that's suddenly looking like a real good game. And then the other game that I'm really going to have a close eye on is their home game on November 23rd when they play Iowa State, which is another team I do want to talk about getting into the conversation. But I think for me, I think Utah right now deserves to be voted back into the field. What do you think?
No, I absolutely agree. I think if they can get past Arizona, they have a bye week. So hopefully sometime in those 2 weeks, Cam Rising can get healthy again. But yeah, they have a pretty easy slate until they get the Holy War. And then Colorado will just be interesting. I don't care where Colorado's at. We've learned that I don't even, whoever plays them, they're going to make it entertaining. They're going to make it entertaining.
I'm so fascinated to see Colorado against Utah's defense. I talked to obviously some of my fellow Baylor graduates after this past week. One, in regards to Colorado, but two, a lot of them were like, okay, I feel so much better about our offense after watching Utah play Oklahoma State. Because it turns out they're just really good. It just turns out that they make quarterbacks look pretty dang bad. And maybe it's not that we have the worst offense in the history of football. So I will say our voters, 72.7%. voted for them to be back in the field. I think that Utah Twitter might have gotten a hold of that one just a little bit, but I think that that's the right decision. They're unanimously back into the field as our Big 12 representative.
Yeah, that's a good one. All right, so let's go ahead and just talk the G5 because that's one we have to add. So it's an interesting situation right now because, as we said, several contenders lost. Toledo lost, as we said, to Western Kentucky. Memphis. It was fun I did not know the middies stormed the field. I did not know they were allowed to do that. And I did not know they could wear costumes over their uniforms. And my friend, who was a West Point grad, said sometimes the leader of a particular, whatever, how they group the students there and the kind of their the sort of a military. I think it's company. I'm not sure, but they're allowed to have a mascot. So that's why there was like a sea turtle running onto the field among all the guys in their uniforms, which I thought was fantastic. But all of that said, Memphis is out. So I was actually just taking a second. So there's three, and you can differ with me if you'd like, but there's three contenders potentially to at least be the G5 representative. Boise State is back in business. They clobbered Portland State. They're now ranked number 25. They're hosting Wazoo, which is ranked technically, if you want to get into the funniness of it, they're the first other receiving vote. So they're number 26. UNLV had a bye. They host Fresno State, which looked surprisingly good. The Bulldogs have only lost at Michigan, which looks better as time is going on. The Price is Right $1 bid. Liberty, which had that weird rain-delayed game at East Carolina versus East Carolina. Pardon me. It was a 4.5-hour delay. I remember I tuned in for a second and Liberty was down 17-0, but they came back to win 35-24. Say what you will, but Jamie Chadwell can coach. But then I just want to point out there's three other undefeateds in the G5 ranks. Army and Navy, who we've talked about, which is just fascinating to see the service academies in the American, who will technically play a non-conference game against each other. But can you imagine if they make the conference title game? Oh my goodness. We talked about that theoretically, but at least for now, it's not off the table. But the other team that we should also mention is James Madison. They had that 70-50 game with UNC. I mean, my goodness. So they're undefeated as well. And at least for the Sun Belt, the leader in the clubhouse, it seems, for that. So those are the six teams that you could potentially pick from. I mean, Boise State at this point seems to be back in the pole position because especially if they beat Wazoo, that'll look impressive because Washington State has looked legit. But where do you feel about that? I mean, the good news is at least a couple of these teams will play each other. UNLV and Boise State will play at one point or another.
Yeah, I feel like it's confusing to me why UNLV isn't considered more of the consensus right now. I mean, they have 2 wins over power conference teams, going on the road and beating Houston by 20 points. And then also going on the road and beating Kansas by 3 points. And Kansas, they have some issues. They don't necessarily look like a world beater, but that's a good win for a UNLV team. And by the way, this is also a team that has played well on both sides of the ball. I mean, holding Houston to 7 points is pretty impressive. The very next week, they got 12 against Oklahoma, who obviously looks like they have a pretty dang good defense. They have to win some games. They actually will have another game that I think will make it pretty interesting when they play Syracuse on October 4th. If they win that game too, I don't know, man. I don't know how this isn't necessarily the top team right now in the group of 5. I think Boise State maybe is a better team right now, and we'll get that game actually, UNLV versus Boise State in Vegas on October 25th. Is that a Friday game? I think it. No. I think that's a Saturday game.
No, it's a Friday. You're right. It's a Friday game.
It is a Friday game. Okay. Well, I think that like that maybe just ends up being one of the bigger games of the season. I think that my vote is in for UNLV right now. I think that that's the team to me that really stands apart for me. Now, I will say, our voters, I put 4 teams up to a vote: UNLV, Boise State, Liberty, and I put Tulane. I think that Tulane has a chance to bounce back. They had good enough non-conference performances against Kansas State and Oklahoma that I think they'll have a chance if if it's a bunch of 1 and 2 lost teams and they win the American. But I Boise State was the winner of our poll with 43.5% of the vote. So they have 1 vote. UNLV has 1 vote. Are you picking one of those 2, or are you going in a completely different direction?
I'm sold on Boise State at this point, only because I think the talent that they have is going to keep them going. And I mean, when you have such an incredible back, that's what makes it to me. Because without Ashton Jeanty, then maybe I'd be more open to UNLV. But with him back there, I think right now Boise State having, and that again, it was a close loss to Oregon, and at that point we were like, is Oregon okay after what had happened obviously at Idaho the previous week? But maybe Oregon was coming together faster than we realized, and it's just that no, Boise State is really that good. But I'm excited only because these 2 are going to get to decide it on the field at some point or another if they can continue to win. And who knows, as NIU pointed out, sometimes it's the team you're not looking at that is the one that's going to punk you. All right, so with that said, we're putting Boise State in as our G5. Now, we technically have 1 more open spot. And I'm going to just ask you, is it worth revisiting Oregon? Or do we also look at some 3 other potential teams out there credibly? You could look at Clemson, you could look at Michigan, and you could look at Notre Dame. What are your thoughts among those 4?
Well, I'm not touching Notre Dame. We are not doing that right now. Let's just I want to throw them out. I'm not interested in considering them right now. I think that all of the others have a little bit of intrigue. I do want to just quickly touch on Iowa State. Iowa State, I think, potentially, of course, as a Big 12 team. I mean, they're 3-0. They have the win over Iowa. They've dominated North Dakota and Arkansas State. I don't think they're quite there yet, but I do think that they deserve to be taken very seriously in this conversation. But let's talk about the 3 that we have. So Michigan, to me, showed that, 1, they have championship culture, right? Like, they have the ability, if they are in a close game at the end, they have the ability to grind it out. I think also they got the perfect game script for them to make it happen in this past game. And I don't necessarily know that means that they're going to be able to do it when they play against, say, Ohio State. I'm curious about them. I don't think they get Penn State. I think they get Oregon, though. Yeah, they get Oregon on November 2nd. I don't know that this necessarily changes a lot how I think about them in regard to those 2 games. So I probably would lean outside on it. Clemson is interesting because I do think that Clemson playing the way that they have the last 2 weeks, a 66-20 win over Appalachian State, a 59-35 win over NC State, makes me think, okay, this is an offense that's starting to figure it out. Whatever you want to say about NC State, their defense is pretty good, and Clemson tore them to shreds. And I think the biggest aspect about this team that's taken a step forward is the receiver position. I think that they've been a lot better. They inserted Bryant Wesco into the lineup as a true freshman. Antonio Williams the past 2 weeks has been a lot more involved in the offense than he was before that. I think that they're not quite... I'm not saying that they have their Mike Williams, their Sammy Watkins, their Hunter Renfrows, but I think that they have some really good players at wide receiver right now who, frankly, a lot of them were just not involved enough against Georgia. And maybe, frankly, Clemson was like, we're not gonna waste our good stuff in week 1. We're just gonna save it to get into the conference play. But I do think that Clemson has a pretty good case right now To me, it's between Michigan and Clemson. Do you have a strong opinion on one over the other?
It's an interesting question. Michigan, I have the same hesitation. I agree, by the way, about Notre Dame. Although I might change my opinion on after they play Louisville coming up, because that's a ranked on that'll be an interesting one. Or maybe it'll just put Louisville to sleep out of the entire conversation.
Yeah. By the way, their win over Purdue looks a lot less impressive because Purdue looks like an absolute disaster right now after losing by 17 points to Oregon State.
Yeah. No. With Clemson, it's interesting because we were wondering that too. Was Georgia just that great? And also perhaps this is another variation of the USC Alabama game we were talking about, where it just sort of knocked sense into the team that got it completely pantsed on national television. So, I mean, Clemson should have an easy time here with the majority of their schedule, especially now that Florida State is certainly not the team we thought they were going to be. We're going to see exactly where they go. Michigan, I also have that trouble with. Michigan, I think, proved that they are going to be a upper part of the Big Ten. Just like, USC is probably also going to be an upper part of the Big Ten because that game could have really gone either way at the end. Neither one has put me in a position to believe that they're going to challenge to win or be a credible at-large competitor in the college football playoff. I think teams will figure out, especially the elite teams, will figure out ways around them. When it comes to those, I'm interested you didn't think Oregon was part of this conversation. I just want to say, granted, they had a bye.
That was actually an oversight. Oversight. Yeah, I think Oregon is interesting. So obviously, I expect them to, as the season goes along, become part of this conversation. But I do think that part of getting voted back onto the island is also having a game in a week to vote yourself back onto the island. They didn't play this past week. I think that's why they're not top of mind.
And they're kind of hosed because unfortunately the next game they have is at UCLA, which is a very weak team right now. And then they get Michigan State. But of course,
that's Friday
October
game.
12th, they can put themselves right back into it with Ohio State.
Yeah.
So
I think for me, obviously, look, what are we going to learn about them on the road against UCLA? Probably not a whole lot, but I think that I would rather them get back in after playing a game and looking good than getting back in.
I can back that. I can back that. I'm done with that. So really, it's coming down to Clemson then. I don't know if I'm convinced enough about Clemson only because NC State's looked so weak. So I don't know if I'm up for putting any of these guys back on the island at this point.
Okay. I am going to vote yes for Clemson. I think that Clemson, it's a combination of things, right? It's a combination of path. It's a combination of elevating themselves. And Georgia just does this sometimes, right? Like Georgia a couple of years ago, back in 2022, they beat Oregon week 1, 49-3. And Oregon was 7 points away from making the college football playoff anyway. Right? Like they still ended up being a really good team. I think that when you look at the group of teams that Clemson has to play, I think that they still very much have a pathway to being there.
I think you've convinced me on this because I'm looking at it. I mean, frankly, I'm very curious to see how the Stanford game goes because Stanford has ended up being a real mystery. They're the ones that ended up surprising Syracuse, which I did not expect. But, we knew Troy Taylor was a good coach. We knew that. So, and if you're a good coach, Stanford can give you just enough players to do it. Let's put Clemson out. Let's have a full slate. Right. I like this.
Let's have a full slate. And no, I will say the only team that got a yes vote from our voters was Oregon with 59.8% of the vote. Clemson got a no. Actually, in addition to Utah, who I mentioned, Clemson got a no. Michigan actually with 78% of the vote still got a no. They're going to be interesting, right? Because like we talk about, I mean, we think that Oregon's going to be back in pretty soon. And so Michigan's going to have to play Ohio State and Oregon. And if they lost both of those games, are they getting in with that? Are they getting in with that particular 9-3, although they would have a win over USC, who maybe could be a playoff team? I don't know. It's going to be a really interesting schedule. I think that part of this also has to come down to your true evaluation of what Illinois is. Because they go on the road to Illinois, that suddenly looks like a much more difficult game than it did a couple of weeks ago. These are two teams that want to play in the dirt and roll around in the mud in a similar kind of way. they're interesting. Also, by the way, can't overlook it. They go on the road to play 9 Indiana in the month of November. So I think that their path looks a little more difficult to me than it did at the beginning. So yeah, I think Clemson's the team right now. I think let's put them in.
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, it's been kind of funny to see these teams at the periphery. I mean, we didn't mention them, but Indiana, Rutgers, UCF, Duke, and Pitt are also undefeated. So let's see how long they can last. We'll just say that. But when we get back from the break, we are going to take a second to rank the head coaches of our 12 playoff teams here on the College Football Survivor Show.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.
Well, that was a busy first half of the show. I mean, we had a lot of teams to talk through, but let's talk about ranking these coaches. So obviously USC, we've taken them off the list. NIU's off the list. Kansas State is off the list with a couple of other teams in there. And now we have to actually also consider Clemson in all of this, but and Boise State. Let's talk about it. I think it's safe to say at this point, well, I'm going to leave. It's a good setup, really, as you pointed out before we started recording, for this weekend's upcoming game where Alabama is, of course, hosting Georgia. Are you putting Kirby Smart as number one?
Yeah, he has to be. He is the consensus number one coach in college football. He's the only coach right now with multiple national him and Dabo Swinney, I guess, are the only two coaches right now with multiple championships in college football. Mac Brown, I believe, the only other national championship coach in college football right now. It's crazy how much of a drain there's been over the past couple of years. Of course, Dabo Swinney won his in 2016 and 2018, Kirby Smart in 21 and 22. They had a great team in 23. They have a team capable of winning a championship in 24 as well. I think this is just Kirby Smart's moment in so many ways. So to me, I think that he's not only number one, I think he's a pretty easy number one.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I had a little more difficulty going beyond him, and like a lot of our rankings in my mind, I almost thought of them as tiers rather than straight up and down. Like I would give this person a linear ranking. At least after Kirby Smart, he's earned his spot hands down.
Well, and I think here's an interesting question too, is when you're ranking coaches right now, how much are you ranking the history and career of the coach? How much are you ranking what this coach is right now, a snapshot in time? Because I think that you can answer this question in some ways with who you have number two.
Yeah, and I will, because mine is Steve Sarkisian, because it's fascinating to me. There was a guy who was hired, who had a history as a head coach at top programs before, who fell from grace, wanted to get back in. The hire raised a lot of eyebrows for such a prominent job. Like, okay, I could see him being a coach again, but and didn't get a great start, quickly showed progress, and his name was Pete Carroll. And here we have a guy who was on Pete Carroll's staff from when he got to USC. Only the one break he took to go in the NFL and then came back as an assistant. And he's becoming exactly like his mentor. And I was one of those people who was 100% skeptical of what is Texas doing hiring him. I know he went to the Alabama, the Nick Saban school for rehabilitating coaches, but I wasn't convinced of it, particularly at a program at the nature of Texas. But he has proven me wrong. He is because Texas is one of those programs like a USC, like a Miami, where people are like, man, they have all the talent. Why can't someone just steer the car correctly? And he has found that sweet spot. I mean, the more this season goes on, the more Texas seems like last season wasn't an aberration. Not that you or I thought that, but I mean, certainly watching that Michigan game and now looking at Michigan now, and the team that they have been and the level they've been performing at, I am impressed. And I didn't think I would put Sarkisian this high, but I'm going to put him as number two only because at this point, if I had a ride with any coach after Kirby Smart, I'd feel most confident with Sarkisian.
So I think that if Texas makes it through this season and continues to be what they seem to be right now, then I would potentially put him at number two. But they had a great year last year. There's no doubt about it. They had a great year last year. They've elevated themselves, of course, with that win against Michigan to number one in the country. And they haven't been number one since 2008. It's an incredible run. But I think that his track record for me is still a little bit incomplete when it comes to ranking him as high as number 2. I have him right now at number 4. And I think that this group is kind of a tier, I think, in some ways to me, but there's no question that he's built the roster. Now he's got to go through an entire season in the SEC with these expectations. Because right now his accomplishments at Texas, right, are he went through a season and he won the Big 12 and then lost a playoff game, right? Like that's what we have from Steve Sarkisian right now. So there's a level of projection that I think we can and probably should do to get just like to the end of the 2024 season. But I want to see him play out the 2024 season and play Georgia on October 19th and have an opportunity to play for an SEC championship and see if he can win that SEC championship, see where they end up in the playoff mix. So I had him just a little bit lower because of that, because I just want to see the season to fruition. There's a coach who, like, I don't want to, like, overreact, but he's coached against him twice and beat him both times, and now is coaching at a program that's as good or maybe better than what he's dealing with right now. That's Kalen DeBoer. I think that Kalen DeBoer is so criminally underrated in some of these rankings because when you talk about Kalen DeBoer, yes, of course, you have the NAIA stuff. That's not especially relevant, but I think it matters. You have what he did as the offensive coordinator at Indiana and at Fresno State and as a head coach at Fresno State. But that Washington tenure is insane. Like what he accomplished at Washington in only 2 years is ridiculous. And sure, obviously he had the great quarterback there, but like nobody had done anything with Michael Penix quite to the level of what Kalen DeBoer was able to do with it. They had a lot of the talent on their team back during the failed Jimmy Lake years. Kalen DeBoer was able to take it, and he went 25-4, I think was his record at Washington. Now he's at Alabama. To this point, they've been super dominant. They've been, one of the best teams in college football so far. And look, he's also someone who we got to see what happens for the rest of the season. I mean, we're potentially going to have a check-in with Kalen DeBoer in Alabama on the later show this week. They're playing Georgia this week. We're going to get some indication of how does he hold up in these moments when he has a team that's as talented as anybody in college football. I think it's a good question, and it's going to be a good measuring stick for him. But I think he deserves to be number 2. I think that his accomplishments are, frankly, just a little underrated.
I had him as number 3. So I agree with you almost entirely. I think at this point, though, when it came down to it, I just have I want to just see how he does with Alabama a little longer. And this weekend's obviously going to say a lot about that. But I agree. It was a tough one. And I think everything you said is right. Kalen DeBoer knows how to win. He certainly seems to have figured it out. He even did what Nick Saban did and had trouble with South Florida for half, and then
only the greats do it. Only the greats do it.
I mean, someone forgot to tell Mario Cristobal that. But yeah, so I mean, I have a lot of faith in him, and certainly I'm not denigrating him at all. I think this is one of those situations where you could easily have switched both of them. And in my mind, he is one of my top tier coaches based on what he's done, based on where he's done it, and his ability to do that everywhere. Now, I'm curious. So I had Kalen DeBoer as my number 3. Who's your number 3?
My number 3 is Kyle Whittingham at Utah. And it's funny that we got to get Kyle Whittingham and Utah back onto this list because, of course, they wouldn't have before we had our vote just a moment ago. But his track record, of course, is great. Like it's really, really good. But if he continues like this, right, he won 2 of the last 3 titles in the Mountain West, and the only one that he didn't, he was starting a former walk-on at quarterback, which he deserves some blame for that, certainly, that they didn't have a better quarterback situation, and frankly, a little blame that they don't have it this year. But he has built a team that in his first year is already most likely the best team in the Big 12. The 2 of the past 3 years, he built the best team in the Pac-12. His run of success at Utah is outstanding. And I think that what's most impressive about it is that it took them a little bit to get going as a true contender in the Pac-12, but he continued to elevate. he continued to make the team better and better. There wasn't like a solid, like, we're going to be 9 wins forever. There was a moment that they hit the 10-11 win mark back in 2019. And that's kind of where they've lived almost every moment since then. So I think that, look, it's fascinating and it's kind of funny. I will mention my last place coach on this list is the Boise State coach, Spencer Danielson, because he's a first year coach. He really has no track record at this point. I think there's an interesting conversation of how you evaluate guys who are doing more with less versus guys who are doing more with more. I think certainly doing more with more is more valuable than doing more with less, but doing more with less is more valuable than doing pretty good with more. So, of course, we're not going to have that conversation with one of the group of 5 coaches on this list because it's particularly the first year Boise State coach. But I think that Utah's Kyle Whittingham is kind of the perfect example of like, this program changed because Kyle Whittingham is the coach there. And I think that if you, to me, end up in a one-on-one ball player situation, like Kyle Whittingham might be one of the first guys I call on this list.
Yeah, absolutely. He was my number 4. So it's funny, our top 4 are identical, just in slightly different shuffling order here, because what he's done, I mean, people don't realize how, I mean, some of our younger listeners, or maybe folks who just aren't as ready with this kind of trivia, he's succeeded Urban Meyer at Utah after Urban had that perfect season. Was it the perfect season? The season he left, but anyway, back in those days,
I think so.
Yeah. So I mean, he took that ball and ran with it. And I remember, it took, I think like 5 seasons, and he got back to an undefeated season where they went to the Sugar Bowl again and finished the AP number 2 that year. So Utah has always, like under Whittingham, Utah has stayed this consistent program that even with occasional dips has always managed to kind of find its way back to the top. And at this point, they're back in our conversation because they do exactly what Utah does, which is find ways to win in their own brand of football. They don't change. They don't chase trends. They've been very good at what they do. And I think they are an easy pick for that spot, especially in our top 4 kind of tier. And it's funny too, before we started figuring out who the G5 team was, I actually was like, okay, I could put the G5 coach up to about number 5 is kind of my spacer between first-tier coaches who are just great and then other coaches who I think are good but haven't quite proven themselves up to that level. However, because we went with Boise State, I actually put them all the way to the bottom because I'm like, I can't tell if this is Ashton Jeanty or if this is Spencer Danielson at this point. If it had been like, and I mean, Liberty was not one I was going to vote for, but Jamie Chadwell, okay, I could see ranking him pretty dang high because what he's doing is unreal. Barry Odom is somewhere in between because at Mizzou it was a little more kind of odd.
Well, and look, if this is like last year and we're having a Jeff Traylor conversation, or if like later this year we're having a GJ, like there are a great group of 5 coaches who I think can contend with anybody on this list. I just don't think that that's the guy who we have on the list right now. And I'm actually
I've heard the worst possible candidate for this particular list.
for this list. And by the way, I have heard from people that Spencer Danielson, like they are convinced he's going to be a star in the industry. So like in 5-10 years, maybe we're having a different conversation about him. But it's year 1. There's nobody else on this list who you're talking about as a year 1. I mean, again, Kalen DeBoer's first year at Alabama, but he led his team to the national title game last year. So there's nobody else who you're really talking about as a first-year head coach.
So in my next tier, I went, and this is where it gets the fuzziest group in my mind because they're just a bunch of guys who can coach well, and then they all have flaws. I think only because based on the fact that he keeps getting himself into playoff opportunities, if not into the playoff, I went with Ryan Day. Only because also I respect how he's been willing to adjust and go with his old coach as his offensive coordinator. I respect those kinds of decisions. I mean, Lincoln Riley isn't in this discussion, but I respect the fact that he finally said, okay, I'm going to hire a new defensive staff, and apparently let them do enough to make that defense good. Because we were talking about that. Can they even practice right? Well, clearly they are. But for now, Ryan Day's fitting in that zone for me. I mean, I just feel weird ranking him lower than number 5 at this point.
So I'm gonna group these next 2 together in some ways, and I'm gonna describe it as the guys who can't win the big one, but obviously are very positioned to be able to eventually win the big one. And that's Ryan Day at number 5, and that's Lane Kiffin at number 6 at Ole Miss. To me, like, you can't ask a coach to do more on paper right than what Ryan Day has done the past couple of years. I mean, the roster that he's built is insane. The scheme that he has offensively is insane. I've actually had this conversation with a lot of people. Offense is down right now in college football. Like, defense is kind of winning right now. You look around the sport right now, and there really just aren't that many good offenses. Again, to go back to some conversations I've had with some Baylor people, all of them are like, well, if we hired a new coach, we should just hire a crazy offense coach. And I'm like, I don't know that exists right now in college football, especially, by the way, in the Big 12 or the Big 10, where obviously defenses are so dominant. And even, I mean, we're seeing right now USC's trying to get around the fact that they can't just do crazy stuff with Lincoln Riley. Well, Ryan Day and Ohio State, while they've been at times clunky offensively, they've been the most efficient offense in the country. They can beat you on the ground. They can beat you through the air. They have dynamic receivers. They have dynamic running backs. They've gotten good quarterback play. They blocked, like, what more do you want from Ryan Day at this point? And the answer is to beat Michigan and win a national championship. That's the only thing he has left to do. But like, I put him at 5 because I think the answer is like, well, he'll probably do it. He'll probably do it. Whether it's this year, I mean, frankly, it really should be this year. I picked them as my preseason national champion, but I feel pretty confident that's going to happen. And Lane Kiffin, I mean, look, he's not at a have-not, but he's at a program that's not Alabama or Georgia, certainly. This is, I think, a big team for him to say, well, look, I'm not going to beat Alabama and Georgia every year, but I can contend with them. Georgia comes to their place, I believe, late in the season, and they spent so much of their transfer portal priorities and money beefing up the trenches. They got a player like Walter Nolan in. So I think that, again, that's a coach who, to me, is doing essentially everything right, but just hasn't necessarily won the big one. So I have them at number 6.
That's an interesting one. I actually went with his doppelganger from the other conference. I went with James Franklin as number 6 for very similar reasons. Only because, again, with my only reservation with Lane, and I ranked him there was even one more person I ranked ahead of him. He does occasionally well with Ole Miss, and he has had good moments, even with USC. He had that season where they couldn't go bowling, and they had a great regular season. At FAU, he managed to turn that team. He managed to get everyone's attention, which is how he was able to parlay it into the Ole Miss job. But I just don't know if he's quite reached a level where I'm confident that this Ole Miss team is going to be a terror and is going to win the national championship. Now, I could say the same thing about Penn State. The only thing I'm giving James Franklin the benefit of the doubt is he does it more often. He just manages to get there, and there's this roof that he somehow keeps slamming his head against. But dang it, if he doesn't try it with enthusiasm.
Well, I will say, I will push back on that just a little bit. So since the pandemic season, assuming, because I feel pretty good assuming this right now, if Ole Miss wins 10 games, this will be the 3rd time in 4 years that Ole Miss has won 10 games. And they won 11 last year for the first time in program history. So, like, I get, like, that Penn State has been pretty good, but I would also argue that Ole Miss is a much tougher job and program than what Penn State is. Like, Ole Miss has actually only won double-digit games 9 times in history. Whereas, Penn State, of course, it was mostly under one coach, but they've been that level for a long time, and they played a much easier schedule to get some of those wins. So to me, I actually had James Franklin down at number 10 on my list. Wow. Because I just haven't seen since 2016 him have any ability to even reach up and, like, nip at the heels of some of the better teams in the conference.
It is funny to see that, yeah. Because so for me, again, I had Lane down at number 8. Well, now I'm curious. Who did you place as your number 7?
Yeah, this was the most interesting one to try to place, and that's Dabo Swinney at Clemson, because he is, outside of Kirby Smart, the most accomplished coach on the list by a pretty good margin. He's built elite programs. He's built elite rosters. He is one of the best recruiters in the entire country. And like, whatever you want to say about, Dabo not going all in on NIL or all in on portal, like the fact that they're able to continually build these elite rosters without going headfirst into all of these things is insane. The issue and the thing that makes him hard to place overall is that I think that he is he seems to be a little past his prime. But maybe not. I don't know. I think that that's what makes him so hard to place. And I've liked what I've seen in my early returns this season, but that's why he's at number 7. If he was at the top of his game, he'd clearly be top 2.
Yeah, I placed him at number 9 for me only because of the concerns over stagnation and can he I mean, granted this season has turned around a little bit, but there's still quite a bit more season to go and I'm curious to see if he can keep this, does he still need these Tyler of Spartanburg moments in order to get the team on track? I'm not sure. So my number 7, and this is one where I felt it was a little more controversial, but or I should say my number 7. Pardon me. So my number 8 was Lane, as I mentioned. Number 9 was Dabo. I wanted Mario Cristobal only because it's easy to not like him. It's easy to see mistakes he makes. I don't believe they've still yet taken a knee. No, they took a knee at the end of the first half of this last game, which again proved that he can do it, but. I remember what he did at Oregon, and he got them to be competitive. Now, granted, it wasn't as great as his predecessor, but I thought it was solid. And with Miami, after 2 so-so seasons and disappointing seasons, I think what he's doing there, what he's built together, I think if he can find his way, I think he has the ability to be a good CEO coach if he can pull in the right be his own. I don't know if he's got to be his own general manager, but put together and assemble a team that can win. I have a little of more faith in Mario Cristobal than I think most do. Now, I'm waiting to hear you say he's your number 11. I'm just curious to see where this is going.
He is not my number 11. He's my number 8. He actually, to me, is close to that level of he hasn't won the big one, but he clearly will, because I think that some of his game management stuff is stuff that I worry about with him being able to win the big one and get the program to that level. But at the same time, I do feel like we forget that he won 2 Pac-12 titles at Oregon. Like, I just feel like that's just completely erased from his history. And they're like, whoa, his first year as a head coach was when he ruined the game against Georgia Tech. Like, no, he's done stuff before. He has a resume. He's built a team that's one of the best in the country now. Again, it's the little mistakes that they make is the only thing that has him behind the Swinney line for me versus Lane and Ryan Day being above the Swinney line.
I think some people forget 2021. I mean, they lost 3 games, but 2 of them were to Utah. It was just like one of those, well, it's kind of like what Oregon ran into with Washington last season. It's like sometimes there's just that other team that's got your number that season.
He's very good. Again, we'll see if he can take the leap to becoming great. That's certainly, I think, something he has to do. And this is the year where we're going to, I think, figure it out, because they have, I mean, Clemson, again, talent-wise is up there with anybody, but I think that they're the most complete team in the ACC this upcoming season. If, look, if they lose the ACC title game in a close game, I don't think it's a disaster or anything, but they better be in the ACC title game at the end of the year. They better be a 10-win team at the end of the year. And frankly, I expect that to happen.
Absolutely. Well, okay. So right now, just kind of looking at our lists here, we know where I go down to number 9 with Dabo Swinney. Who's your number 9 after Mario Cristobal?
Yeah, my number 9 is Josh Heupel at Tennessee. This is a coach who is so interesting to me because I just assumed he was going to be a bridge coach. I just assumed that he was going to be a placeholder whenever he was hired at the University of Tennessee. But instead, he has been pretty dang good. And I will say, I think that some of that has to do with administration doing a really good job and Tennessee's NIL operation doing an incredible job. I don't know that as a traditional recruiter that Josh Heupel was over the moon necessarily. it matters a little less now whenever you get to do recruiting this way. And I think he's built a fantastic administrative program. And like we saw this past week, the final score is 25-15 against Oklahoma, but that game was not close. Like they could have kept trying to score points and ended up with a lot more than that. I think that the most impressive thing about his team is that people are like, oh, the way that Tennessee wants to play in this offense is they're gonna chuck the ball down the field and try to put up huge like, no, they're awesome on defense with defensive coordinator Tim Banks, and they are awesome running the ball as well. So this is, to me, a more complete team than people realize. And I think that Josh Heupel, not just coming in and coaching well is a big part of that, but also coming in and setting a culture and really calming things down in so many ways.
Yeah, he was my number 10, which means we have a consent because we've said our 12. All respect, Spencer Danielson. It's just too early. You had James Franklin as number 10. So that means our consensus 11 is Eli Drinkwitz. Then I know where I did it. It just seems like, honestly, I mean, yes, he had a one and done amazing season at App State, but Mizzou has just always been kind of this. We were wondering if he was on the hot seat, and then suddenly last season, was it a one-off? Was it a surprise? And then this season, every game seems to be excitement for the Tigers. Where are we placing them? I mean, why did you place them here?
Yeah, I mean, it's just track record to a large extent, right? Like it's one incredible season, and it was an incredible season. Again, we've seen. I don't even want to go as far as saying cracks early in this second sort of campaign for them, but just look at every other team on this list, right? Like they have a level of track record, they have a level of success that I just don't think he's quite reached as yet. Partially because he's a relatively young new coach compared to the rest of the field. So I don't think that this, to me, is a shot at all. Like I think that Eli Drinkwitz, what he's building there, is something long term that's going to be huge for them. And ultimately, I think that this could be a staff and a coach that ultimately shoots up this list in the next couple of years. It's kind of like the conversation I was having about Steve Sarkisian. Maybe by the end of this year, if they have another top 10 finish and are in the college football playoff, maybe you're ranking him number 6 on this list when we're doing this a year from now. But right now he has the one, and on top of course, the 1 year at Appalachian State. I think that he is right now in wait and see mode. Not even wait and see mode. That makes it sound too derogatory. I think that he is in potential mode and time to be realized.
Absolutely. Well, that was our list. Those were 12 coaches, and we did our best to rank them all. Pretty similar overall. I do like the fact that we had the same top 4 and the same bottom 2. Oh, my goodness. All respect to all of them. They're all excellent coaches. But I wanted to go ahead and thank all of you for listening. Thanks to our producer, Joey Aliberti. Be sure, if you can, to like, rate, and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can find us on X and TikTok at CFB Survivor Show. He's Shehan J. Raja. You can find his work at cbssports.com and at Shehan J. Raja on X and TikTok. I'm Bobak Hayeri, part of the group that runs Reddit CFB. Thanks for listening.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.